And now that it's all about each other. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for a public meeting on the Conservation Sonoma, the Habitat Conservation Plan and the Natural Community Conservation Plan. I'm Stephanie Horry. I'm going to be your facilitator for this evening. So really I'm glad to be here and welcome you all and just seeing all these notifications there. So before we get started, I'm going to actually turn it over to John Mack, who is online virtually, but turn it over to John Mack to do some welcoming comments. Let's pull up the meeting objectives. Perfect.
Yes, can everyone hear me okay?
Good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, hello, everybody. I'm coming to you actually from Ohio. I had to come back here for this week to help my mom out with some things, but so I'm sorry not to be there in person. Thank you all for attending tonight. This is a auspicious night. This is our first, official public meeting and public contact on this process. Some of us here in the room have been engaged in this in various ways for several years, and definitely for the past year, quite a bit. So tonight is really a start-off meeting, and it's supposed to be able to cover a lot of background material and sort of set the framework and get everyone sort of up to speed on what is actually a relatively complicated area of law and policy and that, although in a lot of ways it boils down to quite simple things in the sense that this is basically getting a very long permit and that will last a long time, that will both advance really proactive conservation strategies in a way that we can't do in the ad hoc way that we have available to us today, and also provide what is hoped to be a more efficient, process that gets us to doing projects that we want to do and that we think makes sense. So tonight we're going to share a lot of information and background about the context that we're in, both legally and from a policy perspective, discuss sort of where we are at in the process, and then have quite a few touch points through the course of this meeting to check in. And then towards the end, one of the other things that will be kicking off over the next 12 months is what's called the Public Advisory Committee, which is a more in-depth group that will stay with this process fairly consistently for maybe a very long time, several years even. So anyway, that's the overall objectives.
Great.
Right.
Thank you very much, John. I can, next slide, I think is on the agenda, so I can go over that really quickly. And so after we do these welcome introductions, I'm actually going to turn it over to Bernadette with ICF, the technical consultant, who will take us through the regulatory context for the HCP and NCCP, and then move into what does that actually mean for, what does the HCP and NCCP look like actually for Sonoma County. So we'll have those major presentations. We'll certainly stop for like a moment for clarifying Q&A, as well as longer time for open Q&A. And then we want to go over the public engagement opportunities. As John had mentioned, there is the Public Advisory Committee. So I wanted to go over the various options and opportunities for you to stay involved and engaged. And then we have several things for the folks in the room. You'll see you received an agenda packet, and you'll notice like the first page is the agenda. There's a QR code to access the website, and I can actually even for folks on Zoom put a link into the chat for the website. And then you'll notice on the second page there is an actual survey and comment sheet. And so if we're open to hear some feedback on the meetings, how we even heard about this meeting is really, really helpful for us to know how we can improve our outreach. And then as well as there's space for you to, if you have other questions or comments that you want to provide to us. So folks in the room, you'll have that. For the folks who are remote, you can use we have a link that we'll share at the very end today that will take you to a Google survey. or an opportunity for you to do the same thing for the feedback and question and comments. The other, yeah, before we, and Genevieve, I feel like you're gonna tell me, talk to the owl, but go ahead, Genevieve.
Oh, no, I just want to let you know we're not seeing your PowerPoint slides.
You're not?
Oh, I'm seeing them.
I think it's, yeah, but it has the, are folks seeing the agenda slide? John, okay, seeing some thumbs up from folks. So Genevieve might want to double check, see if you're suffering from tons of meeting windows as I feel like I am oftentimes. So let's go to the next slide. A couple of things for today, because we are, as you kind of see, we're working with an owl. So a couple of things that will help us for folks in the room as well as remote folks to be able to hear from everyone. We want to make sure that there's time and opportunity for everyone. So let's try to be as concise as possible. As part of just learning and working towards shared understanding would be great for, ask questions of each other. This is an opportunity to learn from each other. And then very much on the logistics side, for us to be capturing your thought. And you'll have to remind, even us, to speak directly to the owl for the folks online and also for the recording. That is going to be the best way to get a consistent recording sound. So whenever we get to questions and comments, if folks can try to remember, speak to and towards the owl. For folks online, since there's a good number of you, we're going to try to, if you want to get into the queue, use the raise hand function. We'll track the queue as like we're tracking the queue in the room. And when it gets to your turn, we'll call your name, we'll unmute you, and that way you can verbally share your questions or comments. If that doesn't work, there's always the Zoom chat that you can submit questions or comments, and then we'll be able to read those aloud. And for the Zoom folks as well, if you are having any technical difficulties, then Genevieve, who you just heard from earlier, chat her through Zoom, and she'll be able to help you with the Zoom tech. So that's all my fun stuff.
Nope, it's not.
Oh, it's not.
Okay.
Let's move on. Okay, so actually, here is their first Menti poll. So I don't know for folks in the room, if you do have your phones and you can pull those out and do a QR code, and then for online folks, we have a Menti poll that's asking folks of just what are you interested in learning today? And we'll monitor some of the responses, but maybe actually, since it's such a small group, folks in the room want to just raise their hand, let us know, like, what are you interested in learning today about the HCP, NCCP?
Everything.
Legit?
Okay.
Well, just in, getting the overview. Yeah, please. All percent.
How close this HCP is to the original conservation strategy of 2005?
Process overview. 5 bird plant habitat version. Bernadette, I'm going to assume you know a lot more of the context than I do.
And then, also, which animals and plants are going to be covered in the HCP? Because we always talk about the vernal pool plants and the CTS, but are turtles going to be involved? Is it just the valley, or is it going to be up into the hillsides? Is it all Sonoma County? And then, so are we talking down to the Baylands, or are we talking? So a map would be great.
All good questions.
All good questions, which luckily we're prepared to answer. Oh, I see a raised hand.
Yeah. And Stacy, this is where I will
Yeah.
definitely look to your help. I see Steve Johnson has raised their hand and you can.
And Steve, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks. I'm curious as to whether or not you're going to include timber practices as part of the NCCP.
Okay, we are getting a few also Menti responses, like similar original HCP with the overlap there. Okay, how consultation with the Fish and Wildlife agencies, what's that gonna look like? Yeah, the geographic scope of the plans, what is it gonna be, the entire county, parts of the county, so if that's, I believe, also in the presentation and. Yeah, and then promoting moving from plan to action, so the implementation of those plans. All right. Well, for folks online, feel free, this we'll stay on this question, and we're great for you to continue putting that in there. You can also put, your responses into the Zoom chat. We'll be tracking those, but I think for, sake of time, okay, for the sake of time, let's move to, actually to Bernadette's presentation.
Thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. My name is Bernadette Foote. I am with ICF. We are an environmental consulting firm, and the county has hired us to help them develop the habitat conservation plan, natural community conservation plan. I'm the project manager for the consultant team. So main point of contact working with the county. So first part of what we're going to talk about today really is hopefully going to answer some of the questions that you have been asking, but really we want to focus on the regulatory reasons for why the county is embarking on this plan. So we're going to look at the Federal Endangered Species Act, the California Endangered Species Act. We'll talk a little bit about the development process for these types of plans, and then we'll have some time for questions about these specific things before we move on to any other topics. I should say I'm fine if folks want to interrupt in the middle. If something, if you can hold your questions till the end, that's fine. But if you have a burning question, feel free to raise a hand, and we can try to answer questions as we go. So the short answer for why the county is engaging in this plan is that both of these plans, which we're doing as a joint document, will provide legal coverage for incidental take of listed species, both federally and state. So for the Federal Endangered Species Act, we have two agencies that are responsible for implementing that act. We have the National Marine Fisheries Service under the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This also gets really acronym heavy, which I will try not to be. So stop me if I say an acronym and you don't know what that is. National Marine Fisheries Service is under the Department of Commerce. Under the Department of the Interior, we have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And between these two agencies, they regulate all of the listed species. So National Marine Fisheries Service has jurisdiction over marine species and most of the anadromous fish, which those are species that spend part of their life in the ocean and then come up into freshwater ecosystems. On the terrestrial side, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has jurisdiction over terrestrial and freshwater aquatic species. The Federal Endangered Species Act has a lot of different sections to it. For the purposes of today, we're really going to focus on just those sections that are in, well, you can't really see that very well in the room, but the darker sections. So Section 3, covering some definitions. Section 9, which is what is prohibited, what you cannot do. Section 10, which is one of the only ways that you can get an exemption to the prohibitions of the Endangered Species Act. And then section 11, which is some of the penalties, which is the, why are we doing this? Because we don't want those penalties. So under section 3, which defines all of these relevant terms, species are considered in the federal Endangered Species Act. It can include subspecies, fish, wildlife, plants. It also can include distinct population segments of any vertebrate fish or wildlife, which interbreeds when it's mature. We also talk about with fish, evolutionary significant units, and that's similar to a distinct population segment, and it's segments of anadromous fish that warrant protection in a certain geographic area. So there's a lot of different sort of ways that a species can be considered under the Federal Endangered Species Act. An endangered species is defined as one that's in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range, and a threatened species is something that is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. Under the federal ESA, we have proposed species, and that is once a species has been published in the Federal Register as proposed for listing, it's considered proposed. So this usually comes about when organizations submit a petition to either the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service to list a species. The services are required to, within 12 months, make a finding whether that listing is warranted or not. Once the determination has been made that the listing is warranted, the species moves to what's called a candidate species. So it is then warranted for listing, but in some cases it has been precluded for immediate listing because there are other species with higher priorities. So candidate species essentially are those that do require to be listed as either threatened or endangered. It's important to note under the federal regulation that candidate species do not have protections under the federal ESA. So while they are considered a candidate species, there are no legal protections for them. And that's an important difference between the state and the federal regulations. Under the Endangered Species Section 9, which is prohibited acts, all persons are prohibited from importing, exporting, taking, which we'll define, transporting or selling fish and wildlife species that are listed as endangered. The definition of person is public or private entities or individuals subject to US government jurisdiction. So a person doesn't have to be an actual physical human person. It can be any entity that's subject to government jurisdiction. Take under the Federal Endangered Species Act is defined as either doing or attempting to hunt, harm, harass, pursue, shoot, wound, capture, kill, trap, or collect. So it's quite a broad definition. And we'll talk a little bit more about harm and harass as well. I should note here, it's really important that the prohibition against take applies to endangered species, not to threatened. So as part of that definition of take, we have both harm and harass listed. So harm is any act which actually kills or injures a species, and that can include significant habitat modification or degradation, where it either kills or injures wildlife, or it also significantly impairs any of their essential behaviors, which basically are breeding, feeding, sheltering. This is similar to the National Marine Fisheries definition, which it's slightly different, which if there's significant habitat modification or degradation where it actually kills or injures a fish by impairing essential behavior patterns. The definition of harassment is any intentional or negligent act that creates the likelihood of injury to wildlife by annoying it to such an extent that it's going to significantly disrupt those behaviors. I will point out that there is no exemption for harassment. So when we're talking about incidental take permitting, which is what we are engaged in here, the taking has to be incidental to an otherwise lawful activity. This definition of harassment says that that act is intentional or negligent. Therefore, you cannot get a permit to intentionally or negligently take a species. So harassment is not a permittable action under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So I mentioned before that the prohibited acts applies to endangered species. Threatened species have a slightly different mechanism of protection. And essentially here, there's been a couple, oops, sorry, go back. There's been a couple of regulation changes. It used to, there's section 40, which is how protections for threatened species are defined. It used to be that when Fish and Wildlife Service listed a species as threatened, they had the option to define acts that were prohibited for that species. And the protections could be less than what they would be for an endangered species. It was called the blanket 4D rule. And essentially, if they didn't define it, then all of the protections that an endangered species would get were applied to a threatened species. Under the Trump administration, that rule changed and became more consistent with what National Marine Fisheries does and required a species by species 4D rule for any species listed as threatened. Under the Biden administration, we've gone back to the blanket 4D rule for Fish and Wildlife Service. So National Marine Fisheries Service and Fish and Wildlife Service treat their jurisdictional species slightly differently. When anadromous fish or marine mammals are listed by National Marine Fisheries Service, if they're threatened, they will get a 4D rule that defines what protections they have. With Fish and Wildlife Service now, when a species is listed as threatened, they either don't publish a specific 4D rule, in which case all of the endangered species protections apply, or they do issue a species-specific 4D rule. So they have that, they're back to basically being able to blanket cover them. Proposed species, petition species, and candidate species, again, receive no protections under Section 9 until they are actually listed. So as I mentioned, Section 10 is what's called an incidental take permit, and it's Section 10A1B for our purposes. This is the primary way that a non-federal entity can comply with the Endangered Species Act and get a permit for any impacts to a listed species. Section 7, which we're not going to spend a lot of time or really any time talking about today, is when there is a federal agency involved in that taking of a species. And that is a different pathway for ESA coverage. It doesn't apply here because the county is not a federal entity. Section 10 was added to the Endangered Species Act in 1982 to allow for this incidental take pathway for non-federal entities. And the idea behind it was to really create partnerships to preserve habitat and species and to promote cooperation between public and private agencies and entities. And it was really popularized under Clinton and Babbitt in the 90s when this, what we call the no surprises assurances, were added to the act. And that basically gives you coverage over the lifetime of your permit that says that what you put in your plan is what you are required to do, and the services cannot force you to do any other mitigation or compensation without your permission, without your consent, as long as you are upholding the conditions of your permit. So basically, as long as you're doing what you said you would do in your plan, and you haven't, haven't done anything that you shouldn't, then the wildlife agencies cannot put any more obligations on you without your consent. So some of the findings, the important findings that are required, that the federal agencies are required to make to issue you that permit, is that the take is incidental to an otherwise lawful activity. So you cannot get incidental take coverage for an illegal action. If your activity that you are doing is illegal, then by definition, any impacts that you have to listed species is also a violation. You are required to minimize and mitigate the impacts of your taking to the maximum extent practicable. The goal is to fully offset that impact. You are also required to prove that you have adequate funding to implement the plan that you have designed. So that is an important component of the plan development process, is proving that you have the funding to implement the permit. You're also required to show that your impact or taking of the species will not appreciably reduce the likelihood of survival and recovery of the species in the wild. And that is called a jeopardy determination. So the federal wildlife agencies will analyze the impacts of your plan to the species that you are requesting coverage for, and they cannot issue you a permit if your actions would cause jeopardy of that species. So that is one of the findings that has to be made. Incidental take permits do have a fixed duration for plans like this. The permit term is typically on the order of 50 years. So the permit itself will expire after that term. The mitigation that you have to do to compensate for your impacts is in perpetuity, because the impacts that you have had on these species are permanent. So the mitigation must also be permanent. So that's where that adequate funding piece becomes important. The wildlife agencies are required to issue you a permit as long as you have met all of the required findings. Now, there are some circumstances where if you have been convicted of felony violations of the Endangered Species Act, that can demonstrate that you are not a good candidate for an incidental take permit. If the illegal take was technical or inadvertent, there can be exceptions to this. And you can get a notice of non-compliance and get recommended actions to remediate that take. But essentially, as long as you don't have any indication, or the services don't have any indication or knowledge that you have civil penalties or criminal convictions of statutes or regulations relating to listed species, then you can get an incidental take permit. And I should mention that violations of the Lacey Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act also can disqualify you from being able to receive an incidental take permit. So it is actually a voluntary action to apply for an incidental take permit. The services cannot force any entity to apply for a permit. However, if you do not have a permit and you do take a listed species, that is a violation. The services can seek civil or criminal penalties under the ESA for violations. It can get quite costly, including both financially and jail. And criminal convictions, like I said, can result in not only your inability to then get a permit in the future, but can also result in the confiscation of any equipment or vehicles that were used during that violation. So there are some pretty substantial reasons to get a permit if you think that there will be take of species. So switching gears a little bit to the California Endangered Species Act, the department that has jurisdiction to regulate endangered species in California is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. There's the sections of the Fish and Game Code that define the California Endangered Species Act there. The California Fish and Game Commission also plays an important role here in administering Fish and Game Code, and the Fish and Game Commission are the ones who decide on whether species should be listed or not. So petitions are decided by the Fish and Game Commission. Similarly to the Federal Endangered Species Act, under CISA or California ESA, it's limited to native bird, fish, mammal, amphibian, reptile, or plant species. So endangered, again, serious danger of becoming extinct overall or throughout a significant portion of the range. Threatened is likely to become endangered if it's not given special protection. Candidate species are species that are under review for listing, and candidate species under the California Endangered Species Act receive the full protections that a listed species does. So the moment a species becomes a candidate under California Endangered Species Act, they are protected. And this happened very recently with Western burrowing owl. Anyone's been paying attention. Non-native species, so non-native, any species are excluded from coverage. And a few years ago, there was a pretty substantial court ruling in California that determined that terrestrial invertebrates are eligible for listing. So this is a big deal because it means that under the California ESA, we can now list bumblebees, butterflies, and other invertebrates, terrestrial invertebrates. There was always the ability to list aquatic invertebrates, but we can now list terrestrial ones as well. So that's a big change for California in the last couple of years. Under the state law prohibited acts, again, you can't trade in or take endangered or threatened species. So both endangered and threatened species have coverage under the state law. Candidate species have discretionary protection, which means that as soon as they're determined to warrant listing, they are protected. The California definition of take is slightly more defined than it's less broad than the federal definition. So, but again, hunt, pursue, catch, capture, kill, or attempt to do any of those things is considered take. Unlike the federal law, there is no prohibition against harm, injury, or harassment in the California state law. For a national community conservation plan, so there's two pathways to get incidental take permitting under state law. One is what we call a 2081B permit. That's probably what most people are familiar with when you talk about an incidental take permit. It's a short term, usually single species or very limited suite of species. It's limited to only those species that are listed and doesn't come with any sort of long-term assurances. California also has a separate pathway, which is called the Natural Community Conservation Planning Act, which results in a Natural Community Conservation Plan, or an NCCP. This is the state equivalent to that federal habitat conservation plan permit. So it is also a long-term permit. It also comes with the similar kinds of assurances that the federal permit does. It also allows you to include species that are not listed yet, but are likely to become listed in the future, and has some other important benefits over just the regular 2081 permit. The National Community Conservation Plan has a lot more substantial findings required to get that permit than the federal permit does. The first thing is that your plan has to be developed consistent with a planning agreement, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Your plan has to protect habitat, natural communities, species diversity on a landscape level. This is very different from the federal permit, which is really focused on individual species and mitigation for species. The Natural Community Conservation Plan really is a landscape scale ecosystem protective plan and is required to consider things like wildlife connectivity, climate resiliency, climate refugia. You have to support sustainable populations. You actually have to not only offset your impacts, but you have to contribute to recovery of species. So the conservation bar for the state NCCP permit is higher than it is for the federal HCP permit. And because of that, it actually really is, I mean, we call it a habitat conservation plan on the federal side, but the Natural Community Conservation Plan really is actually based on habitat and landscape. So we are required to look at ecosystem functioning and to preserve that. There are a whole lot of other findings here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but basic things like you have to really define what your covered activities are, what activities are allowed within the reserve systems. You have to have adaptive management. A lot of this is very similar to a federal habitat conservation plan. One of the things, and again, you have to prove that you have adequate funding for the plan. One of the things you also have to do is define specifically the rationale for how the conservation measures that you've proposed in your plan will support the recovery of those covered species. So again, higher bar for conservation than the federal plan requires. So just a quick side-by-side comparison of the two laws. Very similar, as you can see. Take of individuals is prohibited under both of them. Under the federal law, habitat is often protected because of the harm definition. Under CISA, it may be protected, but it's required if you're doing an NCCP to protect habitat. For federal species, threatened species get reduced prohibition or often get reduced prohibitions through 40 rules. For the state law, threatened and endangered species have the same protections. Section 7 incidental take statement for federal entities or Section 10 incidental take permit are the only pathways to compliance for incidental take under the federal law. And like I said, for the state law, either 2081B or the NCCP Act is under Fish and Game Code 2835. So the code numbers there. Under the federal law, plants are really only protected where there's a federal action involved. So plants are treated differently than wildlife species under the federal law. Under the state law, plants are better protected. There's some protection from the Native Plant Protection Act. And then also under an NCCP, obviously, part of this is to protect certain natural communities and habitat types of plants receive higher protections. The federal regulation requires federal agencies to consult with each other. So Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service have to consult with themselves and with each other before issuing an incidental take permit. And that falls under the Section 7 process. So that is a requirement of an incidental take permit under ESA. Under California ESA, there's no state agency consultation process that's required. And then under for the federal permit, there's a NEPA trigger to issue that permit. Under the state, there's a CEQA trigger. So that's National Environmental Policy Act, sorry, the acronyms, and California Environmental Quality Act. So by doing this joint document, we will be going through both a federal NEPA environmental review process and a state CEQA environmental review process once the plan has been drafted. So what is a habitat conservation plan? I just threw a lot of regulations and a lot of stuff at you. Really, it's a permit application. It is part of a permit application for a federal incidental take permit. And it is defined as, it's basically, the regulation says, no permit may be issued by the secretary authorizing any taking unless the applicant submits a conservation plan. The regulation doesn't even call it a habitat conservation plan. It's just a conservation plan, but usage over the years has turned it into a habitat conservation plan. So it is a requirement for issuance of an incidental take permit. It has a lot of things in it that are required and recommended. A lot of these are the same components as the Natural Community Conservation Plan. We won't spend a lot of time on this today, but each one of these elements are things that we have to develop for the plan. So yep. So these are all required, well, you'll see some of them just say recommended. Things like we have to define what the impact is to the species, and there's things that are cumulative impacts and impacts of critical habitat. Those aren't required to be defined in the habitat conservation plan, but we often do because they're part of that federal consultation process. So the federal agencies need to understand that in order to issue the permit, so we often kind of do the work for them. Expected outcomes with conservation, not required for the HCP, but is for the NCCP, so it's often included. We're required to have monitoring and adaptive management plans. Talked about all of this a little bit, the funding, what kind of assurances we're requesting, and we have to define within the plan how we would address any types of permit amendments that we think would come up in the future. We have to explain why we chose the alternatives that we did. So we have to essentially analyze different alternatives to take, similar that you would do different project alternatives under CEQA. So there are a lot of pieces that go into these plans to meet those federal findings. So, and again, what is a natural community conservation plan? Again, it is an incidental take permit application, essentially. It's also one of it used to be the only mechanism, the only way to get take coverage for fully protected species in California. So California has some species that are called fully protected, and you are not allowed to take those species under any circumstances, except by doing a natural community conservation plan. There's some exemptions now recently for different types of renewable energy projects, but those are very specific to very certain types of projects. So for all intents and purposes, if you have a fully protected species that you cannot avoid, you have to do a natural community conservation plan. It's also a landscape scale conservation plan, like I said, that really is looking at broader ecosystem based conservation rather than just a single species. And as I mentioned before, it has similar long-term assurances, including the ability to plan for species that are not yet listed. So that's an important distinction and a good reason to do an NCCP, because you can essentially define what you will do if a species becomes listed in the future. And then with that no surprises assurance, you won't be required by the state agency to do anything different once that species becomes listed in the future. There's some requirements for the NCCP that are unique, that are not required for a habitat conservation plan. One of those is this planning agreement. And that is essentially a contract that the plan development applicant signs with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so it is a document that lays out sort of the groundwork for how the NCCP will be developed. That document goes through a public review process. So there is an opportunity for the public to provide comment on the planning agreement before it is signed and finalized. One of the other unique requirements of NCCPs is that public participation is required. So extensive public participation and ways for the public to engage in the process and provide feedback is a requirement. We're also required to incorporate independent scientific review. So there's what is called a science advisors process, where scientific experts with required disciplines for what we're trying to accomplish in the plan are invited to provide feedback on the plan elements. Once the plan is actually completed and you're moving into implementation, an implementing agreement is a requirement that defines who has what responsibility for implementing the permit. And then obviously CDFW has to make all their findings to approve the NCCP. So there's a few extra requirements for the state permit than there are for a habitat conservation plan or federal permit. So this is just moving on a little bit from like what the plans actually are. So how does this work in practice? I said that both of these are permit applications. So once they're approved, once you've met all of the findings, all of the agencies, the wildlife agencies, so Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, and CDFW, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, will issue the permits to the applicants. So that if there are joint applicants, sometimes there's a JPA, Joint Powers Authority, that is formed to implement the plan. Other times, applicants stay individual. Either way, those permits for everybody who signed on to the plan are issued to the plan developers, plan applicants. And then those applicants can then turn around, they're now permittees because they hold a permit, and they can either issue that take coverage to projects that come under their jurisdiction. So for the example of the county, any development projects that come into the county that previously or that require incidental take coverage that previously would have required the project applicant to go to the wildlife agencies to get that permit and negotiate the permit terms with the wildlife agencies. Now they come to the county, they comply with the requirements of the HCP, they pay their fees that are defined by the HCP, NCCP, and they get their permit from the county. So it means that the county and other participating jurisdictions now have control over how these endangered species permits are provided. It also provides take authorization for any agency projects that are defined in the HCP. So public works projects, operations and maintenance activities, other things like that that we've defined in the plan that the county is actually doing themselves would get coverage for that as well. You saw a lot of different components to these plans. So how does one of these things get off the ground? First, you have to decide that you have a permitting need, right? I said an incidental take permit, applying for that is voluntary action. So nobody's going to tell you you have to, but you don't want to be penalized. So you look at your activities and you say, yes, we have a lot of permitting needs. It makes sense for us to do this. Then we enter the plan development phase, and I said here often phased. It's quite a process to answer all of the questions that need to be answered. So we usually do this in phases, and that's partially also due to funding. Once we've developed all the different components, we get a public draft plan that is put out there along with the environmental review for both the federal and state environmental laws. Then permits are issued, and then you're into plan implementation. This big scary graphic is on the project website. There's a lot going on here, But I do encourage you to take some time to review it. It is really helpful. It gives you some of the key questions and decisions that have to be made during this process. It also shows you how the regulatory or required components for public input, where those fall within the process, and how the NEPA, the Federal Environmental Review, and the CEQA, or California Environmental Quality Act review, how those and where they fold into the process too. So you can see in the beginning here, which you probably actually can't read if you're in the room, there's a lot of just basic foundational information that we spend, you know, a good chunk of time analyzing and collating before we can start making decisions. And then we really don't even get into the environmental review until we have a draft plan. So we spend a lot of time up front, and there's a lot of opportunities for public engagement during that upfront process. And then we get into the formal public engagement process that falls under the environmental review. So some of the key benefits of doing one of these plans, because all of the things that I've just said, obviously take a lot of time. They do cost quite a bit of money to answer all of these questions and develop these plans. So why do this? One of the things that, like I mentioned, is that this is going to move that control of listed species compliance from the federal and state regulatory agencies to the local agencies. So local agencies who sign on and become applicants and permittees under these plans will have much more control over the process. It's also going to really improve species conservation in the county. So we take a much broader approach here. We have to look at everything that we think is going to go on in the next, 50 years and plan for that. So rather than project by project and, a little bit of mitigation here and a little project over there, we're looking at this at a broad scale and looking at really creating large interconnected reserves and preserving important habitat areas. And on the development side, this streamlines permitting. So project applicants and people who have projects to do, including counties and cities who participate, who have infrastructure projects that need to be done, having these permits in place reduces the time to get those permits. It reduces the cost because you know upfront what the costs are going to be. So it provides a level of certainty for projects going forward that isn't available in a project by project approach. So there are other benefits, but those are some of the top, the most, I would say, the ones that are brought up the most. And I'm going to stop there because that was a lot.
Yeah, let's take a beat one to let Bernadette take a break and so we can get actual water. Let's pause to see if folks have clarifying questions. And I don't know how easy it is to maybe turn out the light, so maybe give us a little bit of a break and actually see each other's faces. But do folks have any clarifying questions on the background, the context for HCPs and NCCPs before the next part will be talking about the HCP, NCCP specific to Sonoma County and the progress to date and but clarifying questions on HCPs, NCCPs. We have one in the Zoom chat, but one of the folks in the room.
Are you going to be providing copies of the slides?
That was thank you for reminding me. Yes, and that was also a question online. So I think also helpful for folks in the room, so you could all enjoy the actual. Your very, very vibrant. I promise, very, very vibrant images. So we will post a copy of the slide deck onto the website as well. I think definitely for the Zoom people, we have your email addresses because you registered, so we'll be able to email folks as well as the recording. We're planning on posting that to the website as well. So the question that we have in Zoom chat is someone want to know a little bit more about the implementation structure. I don't know, Rue, if you want to expand on specifically of what you would like to know a bit more about implementation and the structure framework or something in particular? Oh, and then Stacy, would you be able to unmute Rue?
I can just say that, we haven't, so this goes back a little bit to whether there's a joint powers authority that's formed. In some cases, if there's a single applicant, like the county, you wouldn't necessarily need to form a separate agency. A lot of these plans, and probably what's gonna end up happening with the Sonoma plan, is that there will be multiple applicants and therefore joint permittees under this plan. That structure hasn't been decided yet as to whether there will be a separate agency formed or whether there will be memorandums of understanding that are written between the permittees. But your permit has conditions and requirements, most of which will be defined in the plan itself. And everybody is going to be required to bear some of the cost and to have required to implement certain actions. And so how that will be structured will be determined by who the eventual co-applicants are. So that'll be a joint decision that's made by the co-applicants.
Thanks, Bernadette. And the next question is more related to some more specifics around the scientific input. So that structure, the how, what, who, when, what points, that will all be done.
Okay, so I will say that technically we have a team of consultants, so it's not just ICF, although we also have our own technical staff. We do have sub-consultants who have different specialties. So it's a very technical team that is developing the plan in the first place. I mentioned the science advisors panel. That's a requirement for the NCCP. Those participants will be determined by components of the plan that we feel that we need expert advice on. And who those participants eventually are will be determined in cooperation with the wildlife agencies. So it's a requirement for an NCCP. So CDFW has some specific requirements about who can serve on a scientific advisory panel. It's not a requirement for an HCP, but both of the services do utilize the science advisors' feedback. And so they also will have some input into who's on that panel. As we'll get into a little bit about the when in the next part here, but soon.
Gotcha. Thanks. We have two more questions, Andrew. I see that you're unmuted, but for the sake of time, if you have some follow-up to Bernadette's responses, throw them into the Zoom chat. Again, we're tracking this and we'll save the chat, so that will be helpful. The next question is more related, clarifying one back to activities that are going to be included into the plans and the incidental take permits.
Yes, that is one of the big decisions that has to be made. It's actually kind of like one of the first decisions that has to be made is what activities are we going to cover. And so that determines a lot of other things. Right now, we're looking at pretty much anything that the county issues a permit for. And I will say that this is a process that we go through. There are a list of screening criteria that we apply to covered activities to determine whether they could be permitted later. So it's a process to determine that. But essentially right now, the county and other plan participants are considering their own public works type activities, operations and maintenance activities, and capital infrastructure projects, as well as their development permitting activities. So no final decisions are made yet, but right now we're taking a look at the broad scale for what would be included in the plan.
John came off mute. Did you want to weigh in on anything?
Yeah,
or-
I was just going to say that it's a really good question. And I would say from my perspective at the county, we're looking very broadly at where the what I would call the pain points are. So for our public projects, for example, a good example is we have to replace bridges and maintain bridges. Often those are crossing streams that have listed cell-mounted species, living in them. And so we have a very high pain point where we have to get very complicated permits even for very small projects. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking for, is where are there where we're frequently interacting with the resource agencies that needing complicated permits for relatively basic kinds of public infrastructure projects. And so those are like the activities we want to include and the species that we want to include, because where are the activities occurring, and then where are the species? The other obvious one is, and I think I heard some questions earlier in the presentation about how the Santa Rosa Plains strategy. So for California tiger salamander at the 4 federal listed flowers, how is that going to play into? Well, obviously the Santa Rosa Plains is another pain point for it's very difficult to do things there without years of difficult permitting on a case-by-case basis, both for public projects and private projects. And so we're looking for those kinds of places where the activity, the permit, and the species are sort of crossing at that point, and it's causing a lot of cost and maybe in the end not delivering a lot of conservation benefit, because it's very ad hoc and case by case. So those are the kinds of things that we're talking through as this develops. And so what that means, though, is there's going to be a whole list of species that are never going to be part of this plan, because given where they live and what's the lack of development pressure or activity pressure in those locations, it's not worth including them, because there's not much they can be addressed through there's many other mechanisms that would address their management. So.
Thanks, John. And actually there are two more, there's a couple more clarifying questions coming in, and I think actually some of them might relate to their next piece. And so I'm going to move, we're tracking the ones that are coming in through Zoom. I'm going to keep pushing us forward. So go through the next slide. You have it really, really fast, please.
Just in response to John's comment, that he was, if I understand what he was saying, was that the HCP and NCCP will only address species under pressure of development, not all federally or state or listed endangered or threatened or state species that are candidates. It won't address them all, just the ones that whoever's preparing the plan feels like are under pressure.
Yeah, so just basically it's impossible to include everything. So there's going to be a process to decide which things should be included and which things shouldn't. And that's part of the plan development process. And we've already did some initial cuts at that with our preliminary feasibility study that was prepared a couple of years ago. And we have a candidate list, I think, that Bernadette's going to show shortly, of what the species that we're currently think are on the short list, which is a couple dozen probably in total right now. But if the question would be, if something's not on the list that somebody thinks should be, then that's something that can be discussed as the plan is developed.
Yeah, and I would just add to that remembering again that both of these plans are incidental take permits. So take being the important key there. If the species is not likely to be taken, then there's no reason to include it in the plan. So that's where it's really important. The covered activities become really important, and what those activities are defined in the plan. Because if those activities do not result in take of species, they don't need to be in the plan. If those activities do result in take of species, both the activity and the species should probably be included in the plan. There are some other screening criteria, but what are the activities and what are the species are two of the biggest questions that we have to answer up front. And for both of those questions, like I said, we have screening criteria that we use and that we apply. And the reason for that is, one, you can all see what those criteria are. It's, you know, we're not sitting in a back room doing this behind the closed door. We're doing it out in public so that everybody can see why we chose the things that we chose. And two, we've developed those criteria based on the findings that the agencies have to make to issue the permits. So if the activity or the species doesn't meet those screening criteria, it's unlikely that the agencies would be able to issue the permit at the end. So why would we spend years and time and money writing those into a plan that couldn't get a permit? So that's why we do this kind of work up front. So, yeah, so.
Sorry, as a quick follow-up then, because this permit is a 50-year permit.
Potentially, that's another thing that we
Are you
negotiate.
looking at species that are in the future going to be listed because of so much development that's happening in these finite, particular, specific areas?
Yes, we do look at the potential for species to be listed in the future and include species that we think will be listed.
I'm gonna keep pushing on. We have about 5 slides for this next bit, and then we're gonna, again, open it up for open Q&A. I'm gonna keep pushing us along.
Yeah, so as you probably know, the county applied for grant funding from the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service as what we call Section 6 grants available, cooperative agreements that are for development of these plans. Each application cycle, you can apply for up to $1 million of federal funding to help with your development. So the county received one of these grants in 2021. And the things that were in that scope for this phase of development are to identify who is going to participate in this plan. Again, confirming what the geographic scope is of the plan. We also need to execute that planning agreement with CDFW, because that's a key component or first step for the NCCP progress. We're also initiating the public engagement process, beginning technical analyses that are required, convening that science advisory panel, and then also securing funding for the next phase of development. So that's where we're at right now. Like, this is what we're working on right now. So where are we with all of these things? So in terms of who is participating right now, we have had multiple meetings with cities, other agencies in the county, departments of the county. And right now we have, I think, four cities. Yeah, so City of Santa Rosa, City of Cotati, Town of Windsor. Roanoke Park, and Sonoma Water are all sitting at the table right now with us in plan development. This does not mean that everybody has decided that they're going to be a co-permittee. We are just at the stage of every one of these entities has determined that it's worthwhile at this point to participate in plan development and see. We've also initiated engagement with the local tribes in the county and have informed them of this process and via separate specific engagement process with Native tribes if they choose to engage with us. In terms of confirming the geographic scope of the plan, right now we are looking at countywide. So there was some, if you've read or if you look at the initial technical report that was written a number of years ago, the focus was either do we do just a Santa Rosa Plain focused plan, which would be actually quite challenging if we were doing an NCCP, or do we do a countywide plan? And the decision so far and the species that we're seeing permitting needs for so far indicate a countywide plan is going to be the most effective. There's likely going to be the exclusion of the coastal zone and the Baylands because that adds a layer of regulatory complexity on top of this that may just be too much. And so far, we're only potentially seeing saltmarsh harvest mouse as a possible candidate species for coverage for some of the entities that are participating right now. So there may be one species, and saltmarsh harvest mouse is also a California fully protected species. So if we do need coverage for that, this would be the mechanism for it. So, but that's right now the only species that we're considering that would dip into anything with salt water. In terms of executing the planning agreement, the draft planning agreement is in negotiation right now. We're getting very close to the finish line, so we're expecting that the public draft of that document will be available hopefully by the end of 2024, so towards the end of this year. So we will definitely notice and put out the notice when that is available for public review. In terms of initiating public engagement process, well, you're all here. So we have some plans for public workshops. We have a dedicated project website that has been launched that will be updated throughout this process. A good place to check in. We have mailing lists that you can sign up for. We're planning to do a community engagement survey coming up in the next few months. And then also planning to convene a public advisory group. We're anticipating that'll be in spring of 2025 once that plan agreement is signed. And we'll talk a little bit more about the public advisory committee a little bit. And then in terms of beginning the technical analyses, we've already started a feasibility assessment for the conservation strategy for the California tiger salamander. Like I said, for the NCCP, one of those conservation requirements is that we're required to contribute to recovery of the species. So we need to know if we can do that for tiger salamander. We can meet that finding. And so we're doing that assessment right now. We have developed a proposed list of potential covered species, like John said, and I can bring that up later. That's at the very, very end. We've also, like I said, we're drafting that list of potential covered activities right now. And then still to come, the things that we still need to do is we'll need to do an initial assessment of the effects of those covered activities, which will help us with that species list. We need to start identifying some high-level biological goals for this plan. And then we need to start developing the framework for the conservation strategy. The science advisors panel cannot be convened until after the planning agreement is executed because of the NCCP requirement. We also need to complete those initial technical analyses so that the science advisors have some information to work with. So we're at this point anticipating that the timing for that panel workshop will be sometime early to mid next year. And then finally, securing funding for the next phase of plan development. We're anticipating the notice of funding availability should be out. It was supposed to be out by Labor Day, but they're now saying, well, it is late October. So November, hopefully. So we think that that will be available in November, and we plan to apply for another grant for the next phase of funding. Okay. So that is where we're at. I think there were a couple of
let's pause. There's a few questions previously for this. One of them was related to, has the California's 1960s fully protected species law fit into this effort?
Well, like I mentioned, the NCCP is pretty much the only way that you can get take coverage for fully protected species in California. Otherwise, you're required to avoid impacts to them. Saltmarsh harvest mouse is the only species that we have identified so far that has that fully protected status that we may need to take coverage for. So that's how that relates. I will say that all of the requirements for the NCCP, including things like preserving habitat and contributing to the recovery of the species, would apply to that fully protected species. So one of the determinations that we'll have to make is it possible to actually impact this species and meet the findings. So.
Thanks. Next question was related to transportation agencies, but they might be subject to this. So how would a transportation agency like SMART be required to follow this process?
Can you define SMART for me?
I can't remember the acronym.
Sonoma County Area Transit. Thank you.
Yeah, there you go.
I'm getting acronyms thrown at me that I don't know.
Yeah.
So, and this actually relates a little bit to the next question, which is, can we clarify what type of entities would apply for coverage? It sounds like it would cover public infrastructure projects conducted by counties, cities, individual businesses, landowners. So these two questions are a little bit related. The short answer is, yes. It applies to county, city, public activities. It also, private landowners, developers could use the plan. Transportation agencies can use the plan. Agencies like Caltrans that have the federal funding piece generally go through Section 7. They have their own pathway. They don't generally use HCPs or NCCPs, although they can, for the state requirements, use the NCCPs. But the federal permitting is usually through Section 7, not Section 10. State transportation agencies that don't have a federal nexus for their projects can use the plan. And there's a difference here in participation levels where somebody like a county or a city has projects that they're permitting that they need to extend that take coverage for, in which case they need to hold the permit themselves to extend that take coverage, versus somebody like a water agency or a transportation agency that knows that they're going to do a project and they want it covered under the HCP because they want their permits they want to know where they're coming from. So they can get what's called a certificate of inclusion in the plan and use the plan for this project. They have to tell us about it so that we can plan for it. But they don't have to hold the permits. They don't have to apply. They don't have to be a permittee. They're not on the hook for implementing the plan. They can essentially use the plan. So a couple different levels of participation.
Okay. The pause and
there was another question that came up earlier about whether timber practices would be part of the NCCP. I will say that, again, we're considering a lot of different covered activities. So we're going to look at what kind of timber practices might need to be covered in the plan and whether we can provide coverage for that. So it's on the list for evaluation.
yeah, maybe we want to take a beat because we do have the Menti poll up, and so folks online and in the room, if you have your cell phones, you can pull up this poll and just asking folks of what do you think should be prioritized in the HCP and NCCP. And let me see if I have magical abilities to. No, I need to find in the room. Oh,
So in terms of that HCP or NCCP vision, sort of potential, would that be identifying the bigger picture habitat corridors, or connections with other space or 50 by 30 objectives from the state? How would, when you're looking at that trade-off between doing a habitat conservation plan and with the county and potentially developers within it, that could be some take, how does that balance what are you trying to do with the bigger, what is likely, what could be likely with the habitat conservation plan? That's not too walking.
So if I heard you correctly, you're asking what's the difference between, or what are we getting as a benefit from doing this plan as opposed to some of the other conservation initiatives like 30 by 30? And
Well, and within the state, within what's going on within the state. And the county with the base district.
Right. So it is different because it all ties back to the take permit. So what we're looking at is essentially activities that we know are going to impact listed species in the county. So otherwise lawful activities, in other words, we know that housing needs to be built. We know that public infrastructure needs to be maintained. We know that economic development will happen. It's defined in the general plans, right? And so we look at what does the general plan say is going to happen in the county or the cities over the next 20, 30, 50 years. And what does that build out look like? What does the impact of that build out look like for species and habitats in the county? And then we mitigate for that. So it's offsetting the impacts that we think are planned to occur, as opposed to something like open space or other initiatives that are just looking purely just for conservation or open space lands and public access and recreation and things like that. So we consider all of those things. We go through a reserve design process. So one of the requirements for the NCCP is not only the mitigation and the offsetting of the impacts, but also, like I said, that conservation bar. So an outcome from the NCCP will be a reserve system, and this will be lands that are protected in perpetuity. Some of them will be intact habitats that are acquired for conservation. Some of them will be mitigation lands. Some of them will be restoration projects, and all of that will be considered, and things that we have to look at are where can we get the most bang for the buck? So if there are other open space or mitigation areas or other pieces, how can we acquire lands to make those larger, more interconnected areas? So it's complementary to the other processes that are going on, but the driving force behind it is offsetting impacts to listed species from planned future development and future infrastructure maintenance and things like that. Does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, I mean, you are saying that yes, we'll try and plug into the big picture, and that there will be public comment on that. And hey, you're not just doing this over here where it's not going to go anywhere.
Correct. Yes, and like I said, we have to maintain wildlife corridors and interconnectivity and consider climate resiliency, and all of that has to be part of the process. So.
I had a question about the reserve system. So is that something that then the county builds up its capacity to manage the reserve system? If these are lands that are acquired and managed and conserved and stewarded?
So again, to be decided, these plans don't happen without a lot of partnerships. And so there are typically land management entities that are involved. And oftentimes land acquisition entities that the permittees would work in partnership with to make sure that you can acquire the lands when they become available. So it hasn't been decided yet who is going to manage those lands. I will say that some things that we have to consider, and other plans, you know, there are lots of other plans in California that you can look at. Santa Clara Valley, East Contra Costa, just in Northern California. Yolo County has one, Placer County has one, which is a very good model for what we're trying to do here in Sonoma. There are a number of plans, especially in Northern California, that provide some really good examples, but parks districts partner and manage some lands for some of these plans. I will say sometimes there are some competing interests there because park districts and other entities where their main focus is recreation and public access, that's not always compatible with protection of sensitive habitats for listed species. So there has to be a balance where, you know, obviously we do want to provide access and preserve open space for access where possible, but there also has to be land that's set aside just for conservation of species sometimes. So
we are kind of running tight on time, so I'm going to, Bernadette, you can review some of the questions there. I'll just let folks know that, I mean, like, one of the things that we're planning on doing is the questions and comments that are coming in, I do believe we were planning on updating an FAQ. There's already some FAQs on the website. I think we're planning on updating it based off the questions and the comments that are coming in today. So just letting you know, like there is a next step to what we're hearing. One thing though, maybe before we go into talking about the public advisory committee, Rich, are you able to pull up what is being presented up on Zoom for the folks in the room?
No, you can't.
Just a minute, sorry for the folks in the room. Many wonderful things are happening. Just that, like I promise, if you all want to just crowd behind me, then you can all see it as well. Let me just share and then we'll reshare. But let's see.
That would work.
I can uncover.
The being recorded. So some of the things that we're saying, you sure? Amazing thing. So, one of the questions we asked for, which we want to see prioritized in the HCP and NCCP, and we received 11 responses. Asked folks like biodiversity. There we go. There we go. Biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. So that one really high priority for a lot of folks. So also sustainability and stewardship. Very top second. Cultural considerations, recreation opportunities, collaboration, partnerships. You kind of see like recreation collaboration is it's more a little bit more spread out. Economic benefits also still being important. That's kind of following in the middle where that help is. So just wanted to do a pulse check with folks, and this is all very helpful. Look at that, even more stuff coming in. Look at all that.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
And this will be just quick, simple yes or no, maybe. Will you be considering using ranch lands, having conservation easement on them so the ranches can still be run? Absolutely. As travel corridors, or not necessarily a mitigation bank because we can't really buy into it, but certainly for travel corridors, right?
Absolutely. Yes. And if you look at other plans, particularly YOLO as a very agriculturally based plan, yes, working ag lands are, and particularly ranch and grazing lands are very important for conservation for a number of species. And there are activities that can be done on those lands that enhance a lot of habitat for a lot of different species. And they are a key component.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thanks. I'm gonna push us forward and we'll stop there and hand it back to Bernadette, and Bernadette is going to hate me for messing with the whole screen sharing thing. But let's turn it over to Rich, who will talk about the public engagement committee.
What's showing on Zoom?
The Zoom folks are getting the prime experience here. So, yes, for Zoom folks, they are seeing like.
Oh yeah, be in just a minute. All right,
Starting over.
no, here we go. No, nope. You gotta go to the agenda. Go. Go. There you go.
Okay.
All right, teamwork. Great. So we'll turn it over, and again, like Rich, if you're able to stand up and make sure you're projecting straight towards the owl.
Okay, greetings, everybody. I'm Rich Stabler. I'm a senior environmental specialist with the county, and I'm going to talk about the Public Advisory Committee. So the purpose, and we'll talk about the purpose and the structure. So the Public Advisory Committee's purpose is to serve as a sounding board with specific charge to review, consider and comment on Sonoma County on the HCP and the components of the HCP, NCCP. Membership will be a group of folks with diverse interests, initially identified by the Conservation Sonoma participants. We'll include a forum to discuss and inform the development of the Sonoma County HCP and Natural Communities Conservation Plan. Each of the PAC meetings will begin and will be open to the public to attend and provide comments. So it'll be an open forum, completely transparent. Will include interest-based and consensus. It'll include an interest-based and consensus seeking approach, basically. This is the base there. It's anticipated to meet no more than quarterly. So this is kind of an advertisement. Next slide. The responsibilities will include review working draft on draft materials, prepared during the planning process on covered activities. It'll include biological resources, conservation strategies, cost to implement the Sonoma County HCP, NCCP, and also funding strategies as well. It'll also include offering perspectives and communicating interests while seeking to understand the issues presented and the perspectives and interests of other PAC members. So that's really important that there's a public advisory. They'll work cooperatively with other public advisory committee members. That's really important. And commit to attending PAC meetings on a regular basis, quarterly. Public advisory committees members are expected to serve for a minimum of 2 years and then encouraged to serve for the duration of the plan until it's to the implementation stage. Development is currently anticipated to be about 4 to 5 years. It could be longer, but we're hoping for that. Next slide.
And just a friendly reminder, again, it starts to cut out a little bit, so I don't know even if like one step forward or just making sure that I speak to the KPIs right there.
Right, okay. So the public engagement activities and next steps include, we're currently soliciting interest for participation in the public advisory committee. And we're doing planning and community engagement. We're doing a survey that's going to be coming up fairly soon. And for those interested in participating in the public advisory committee, you can go to this link and you can submit your interest. Essentially, it's a email hot link.
A question about the makeup of the advisory panel. I mean, is there going to be like certain sectors identified and also geographic scope so that you've got a broad representation and go out and, are you just looking for volunteers, which may be heavily weighted to one interest or another, or one geography or another?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's the co-applicants a lot of times that are actually going to be selected, but we want people from development interests as well as conservation interests on the committee, so it's well balanced.
And there's no like elected officials get to choose somebody to represent their district. It's not those kind of commissions. Yeah, so.
It's an advisory board. It is not a decision-making body. And the goal is to have representation from as broad of possible interest groups in the county. So we're asking for volunteers because it is a substantial commitment. There's probably going to be some targeted outreach, especially once we see who volunteers. Because we don't want to end up with, 10 folks from environmental organizations and nobody from the development community and nobody representing the ag community. So we'll see who volunteers and then we'll see where we need to fill gaps to try to fill out as broad of a representation of the county's interest groups as possible.
Okay, John raised his hand.
Yeah.
John, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would just wanted to second that. I mean, we're really looking for a broad, diverse group. We've had recent experience with creating effective groups like this. most recently with the well ordinance advisory committee. Actually, there was two committees. There was a technical group and a more policy oriented group. So we're sort of, we haven't really settled on whether we get a broad set of volunteers that we think is representative, or if we don't, then if we get too many volunteers, we might have to create some type of a selection process potentially. We're sort of taking it step by step without trying to predefine the process. Right now, what we're interested in is who might be interested, and then we can look and say how does that represent the regulated community, the agricultural community, the environmental community, community-based organizations, the tribes. Who are the various groups, and are they interested in? Are we getting that sort of broad-based representation?
And certainly one of the things that we're looking for from this meeting is, so if you have suggestions for who should be on there, how they should be engaged, and we're saying like ask a question in the Zoom chat, just like if whether resource and regulatory agency representatives are going to be on the PAC, and certainly some support for that they should be involved. And so you want to speak on that?
Yeah, I will say the wildlife agencies will not be members of the Public Advisory Committee. Their role, we meet with them on a monthly basis. Their role at this point in plan development is technical assistance to make sure that we're developing a plan that they can then permit in the future. They will likely attend the Public Advisory Committee meetings to both hear the perspectives of the committee members, and also sometimes they give presentations or they're there to answer questions. So that's definitely, they will be participating, but not actually as members of the PAC. In terms of other resource or regulatory agencies, I think we need to discuss that. I'm trying to think, again, it would be similar. I don't see that there would be any problem. These meetings are always going to be open to the public. They're always going to be public meetings. So whether you're officially a member of the PAC or not, you can attend and you'll be able to review the materials and provide feedback on the materials. I'm just trying to think, and we'll talk about whether there would be any conflict of interest or anything like that with a different regulatory agency participating on the PAC, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head, so. To be decided, I guess. At this point, it's open.
And I'll just add, on your comments evaluation form, there is like one of the last questions, I think, is actually like for folks in the room. If you are interested, at least getting updates, again, you can't guarantee being on the PAC or not, depends on what interests submittals we received, but it's there. So if you fill out, please definitely make sure to leave the form, completed form with us. And then Abby, my colleague, if you can actually put in the Google form survey and for the Zoom chat folks, it's the same form, just now in a Google form for all the remote folks.
I'm just gonna, because this question came up.
The proposed covered species.
Yep, we go. So just, this question did come up, and I flipped this at the end here because I thought it might come up. What species are we looking at? And I will say that this is not the final list. If there's not a species on this list, it doesn't mean that it won't be covered in the plan. If there is a species on this list, it doesn't mean that it will be covered in the plan. This is right now the species that we have identified or heard from most from the county and from other agencies and cities and others that we have talked to, that these are the species that we're finding most have issues with permitting. So these right now are at the top of our list for evaluation for coverage. Like I said, what activities go into the plan is really going to determine what species are on this list. But right now, these are the ones that have been identified as most likely going to be covered in the plan. but things change. So. But I did want to put that up there because there has been some initial work done. So, and there were some questions about whether it would be more than just tiger salamander, and yes, pond turtle is on there. Burrowing owl is now a candidate. So.
Again, I just want to emphasize how there's the species and there's the activities. So as an example, right now, the county thinks that keeping the salmon species on the list is important because we have county public project activities where this is a recurring regular issue. We could say though that it's just county infrastructure, road, bridge, culvert infrastructure project activities where we're requesting coverage for those species. And so then private project use permits, ministerial grading permits, ministerial building permits, things like that could very well not be an activity that we include for coverage for those 3 species. So again, there's this layered set of, you can almost think of them as a set of sieves that you start at the top and it drops through the first sieve and then it drops through the second sieve. And if it makes it to the bottom, then it's in. And the sieves are this, the activities and then the species that those activities could affect, and so on as you move down the process. However, as another example, for example, the Sonoma sunshine or California tiger salamander, that would definitely, we're thinking we would be including almost all the county permits that could be issued, potentially grading, building, use, any permit that could have an impact on the species we would be potentially considering in that. So anyway, I just wanted to sort of stress again that this isn't the final list. Things could drop off this, things could come on, and then the activities though that are driving the species to be on the list, that there's activities occurring that could cause take, that's going to be the ultimate determiner.
Thanks, John. Can I just say something very quickly? This list is pretty inclusive of what we have for listed species now. But I can guarantee you that there's going to be more species that should be covered. So you should have, this is something we're dealing with now, these groups here, but then we're going to have a second list and even a third list if these permits are to go for 50 years. Because with climate change, with development happening, with chytrid happening in amphibians, with white nose syndrome happening in bats, it's coming here in California, we're going to see species winked out and they're not going to be covered on that. You're talking about bridges being done. Yeah, pallid bats don't use bridges, but Mexican free-tailed bats do. And there's, up to 10,000, like in the yellow bridge bat, that I mean, obviously I'm talking to people who understand this stuff, but bats are not covered in your bridges that you're taking out. And it would be something very simple to provide habitat in those bridges if you're removing the bridges and building new ones and provide habitat for those bats, even though they're not listed by the state or feds. So.
Yeah. So just one thing to clarify too, we can include species that are not currently listed that will become listed in the future. That doesn't necessarily mean that those species that we would be going out and doing a whole bunch of stuff for those species until they become listed. The other thing that I will say is back to what John said, the activities and the analysis of where those activities are happening and what habitat types are going to be impacted is going to fill out this species list. So this is just what we've heard right now of issues that are coming up, and some of these species are not listed right now. And so, and then there's species like tricolored blackbird that I think, frankly, is probably going to fall off the list. The other thing that we have to look at, because every time we add a species and cover it, there are cost implications into the future for this. And so Western Riverside has an HCP that I think covers 100 and something thousand, not 100 something species. They have 17 or 18, I think, co-permittees. It's one of the biggest plans in the US. It is massive, unwieldy, complicated, challenging, and they're going through a whole process right now of overhauling that whole thing. It's really hard to do plans like that. And after that one, everyone kind of went, okay, that's a little too much. So we have to thread the needle between what's really important and what can we manage and what makes sense and what's feasible. Because one of the findings for these permits is that your implementation is feasible. And that includes the funding piece of it. The other thing we look at is if we cover a species, you know, it's the keystone species effect, right? If we cover, in another plan, I have mountain lion as covered species. We cover the mountain lion, some of the other species like badger drop out because the things that we put in place in the conservation of mountain lion provides the conservation benefits needed to the other species. Therefore, we don't explicitly have to cover them in the plan. So we look at that kind of stuff too. Like, are there keystone species that'll provide coverage, provide benefits to other species, and then we don't have to cover them as well. So all of that gets considered throughout this process. And one of the roles of the Public Advisory Committee is going to be when we get to each of these little stages, when we're talking about like, okay, this is the covered activities list. We want the feedback. We want people to say, yes, we think that should be covered. No, we don't think that should be covered. When we get to the species, we want to talk about that with the group and say, these are the species that fit the criteria. These ones don't for this reason or that reason. So it's all part of the process. Like I said, it's a very transparent and open process. So there will be periods where you will be able to provide feedback on each of these components in the future. We're very early.
So I'm going to, in the Zoom chat, and if you want to actually move back to the slide where it's next steps and wrap up. But just for the folks who are on Zoom, for you to have easy access to the website, as well as the email address that Richard shared. So again, oriented you to the comment form and the Google form, so you all have that. Again, really encouraging folks to go to the website. That's where we're going to be posting tonight's slide deck and the recording. If you haven't already, like, go to the website, scroll down to the bottom of the homepage is where you can actually subscribe to the mailing list specific to Conservation Sonoma. Social media, there's multiple accounts with various ways of saying Permit Sonoma. So if you just search for that, you'll find the social media accounts. And again, the email address if you have just general questions or additional info contacts. So with that, though, I mean, like, again, final questions, comments? Thanks, Genevieve.
Is there any way of, or are you considering finding ways to protect areas that are particularly important for biodiversity and just not development to happen there? And are permits ever denied? Or is it inevitable that permits are going to be given with some kind of mitigation or something?
So that's a two-part question. So part one is, will we be looking at protecting areas just for the sake of biodiversity that will never be developed? And part two is, are permits always issued or are they ever denied? The answer to part one is that yes, there will be areas that are preserved through the reserve system that will be set aside for biodiversity that will never be developed. So the reserve system will be reserved and it will be protected in perpetuity. Part of this process is we do reserve design modeling. So once we've identified what species are going to be covered and we have some biological goals and objectives, we will take a whole lot of things into consideration and do a reserve design modeling process that will identify in a ranked order the most important areas of the county to acquire for protection based on a certain set of criteria. And what those criteria are, all of that again will be decided, as part of this process. So yes, the outcome of this will certainly be some areas that are protected really for conservation. In terms of are permits ever denied? Again, short answer, yes. Like you can't necessarily get a permit for everything. This goes back to the jeopardy analysis that the federal agencies have to do. And in fact, for a state permit as well, you can't jeopardize the species. So we can't write a plan that would allow so much take of California tiger salamander, for example, that it would jeopardize the species and that it would go extinct. So there may have to be some trade-offs. There may have to be some development that doesn't happen in the Santa Rosa Plain if what is included in all of the general plans that cover that area looks like it would potentially jeopardize the species. That's not a permit that either the federal or the state wildlife agency could then issue. So they couldn't issue it to the county or the cities, and therefore the cities couldn't issue it to a developer. So that's all part of the analysis that we have to do. We have to look at what are the impacts of these activities and can they be permitted? So just like if you submitted an application directly to the wildlife agency right now, and your project was going to have such a substantial impact to a species that it would cause them jeopardy, they wouldn't issue you that permit unless you changed your project. So we have an opportunity to potentially change things, or there may just be some things that aren't allowed. And there's an example of a plan in Southern California right now that they're dealing with a species that is already on the brink of jeopardy. And they're having to do a whole bunch of recovery actions to bring that species back to a level that it could sustain any further impacts before they get their permit. So they can't get their incidental take permit until they have done a bunch of work to bring that species back up to a state where it could actually sustain an impact again. So it's not perfect. The world is not perfect, unfortunately, but there are some checks and balances in there, for sure.
The other thing to stress is that all of the counties, I'm just going to speak for the county, all its zoning requirements, all its use permit standards, all its standards for doing CEQA compliance apply to every permit. Still, this doesn't change any of that. Permits could be denied for many reasons or modified for many reasons. All this provides, and it's a big all, would be that if a permit had potential take and needed to obtain federal coverage and state coverage for that take, the county could extend coverage under this permit if it had analyzed that impact and built it into the permit. So, but yes, I would say project permits could still be denied at no matter what they are. They still have to meet all the requirements for that permit that they always have to meet as of today. This is just providing a pathway for endangered species compliance.
If you want to address this question, then you might also have a related follow-up. This seems like a related question.
Can a vernal pool mitigation area hosting Sonoma sunshine be protected forever? Yes, potentially. Yes. Short and sweet.
So the general plan update is, I guess, is also happening. Will this inform it, or how will it work with the general plan update?
So that's a great question. These plans don't change land use authority. The HCP and NCCP doesn't change land use authority. So the general plan is the ruling document. So general plan updates happen. So yes, we are staying on top of that and working closely with that process so that we understand how that is changing. And when we go through this process of analyzing where impacts are occurring, sometimes it becomes clear that something might need to change. And maybe that gets addressed in a zoning amendment or a general plan update or something. But in the short term, the general plan is the ruling document and our HCP NCCP has to comply with what's in the general plan.
I do expect there to be a lively informational exchange between this process and the general plan amendment process. And I sit like literally around the corner from the division manager who's leading that charge. And so, I mean, the information that we're going to be gleaning and developing here will be helpful in the general plan process. It could inform it could inform policies. I could see general plan policies that are supportive of doing an HCP, NCCP. So I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways that it could cross over, but Bernadette's absolutely correct. The current general plan in our jurisdiction and any other participating jurisdiction that has a general plan is taken sort of as a given that we give. It's a given that if that general plan gets implemented fully, that's the impact that would have to be analyzed to determine if the species would put the species in jeopardy or inhibit recovery.
I'm sorry, can I go back to the answer about the mitigation property being, it's already a mitigation property, it's already protected in perpetuity through long-term management and mitigation. So isn't that double dipping if this plan then identifies those areas for additional? It's already.
Well, we wouldn't.
It's already happened. Not.
It wouldn't. Yeah, sorry. It wouldn't be like, we wouldn't be counting it twice in the sense, but we would be, when we're doing the analysis, and this is a good example for the Santa Rosa Plains, there are a lot of already protected lands in the Santa Rosa Plains. We know where those are, and we're mapping those out and including them in our strategy for now, for how they support recovery and of the species. So I mean, so to the extent that there's an existing mitigation bank that's already protected in perpetuity, maybe it's already been transferred. The bank sold all its credits and it's already been transferred to California Fish and Wildlife. So it would be accounted for in the sense that we know it's there and it has a functional role in the ecosystem, but we wouldn't get more credit for it unless we were to go into that location and do something more. Am I correct in that, Bernadette? Like, if we were to propose new restoration activities, new management activities that aren't currently being done to further enhance or further protect, then maybe that could get counted. But no, if it's just there and then we include it in our reserve strategy analysis or analysis of corridors or movements, it would just be an assumed that it's a given, so to speak, that it's there on the landscape.
Yeah, and I guess I read that question as more like, if we end up with a mitigation area from this plan, would it be protected in perpetuity? But John's right, existing areas that are already protected. And the goal of this plan is to protect more, not to just, piggyback on what's already protected. The goal of the plan will be to expand what's protected. Now, using lands that are already protected under the plan is possible if we can, like John said, raise the bar. If we can show that we are doing something on that property that raises the conservation or it's over and above what it already has on it. So in other words, I've heard that there are some sold out mitigation banks that, vernal pools are filling in and they're no longer holding a hydro period that is supportive of CTS reproduction. So sorry, California Tiger Salmon. Fucking acronyms, love. So if there's potential to maybe do a restoration project there, to maybe do more work on that property, to translocate species that aren't there onto that property, there are options, but in order to get credit for that, you have to very clearly show that you're doing something above and beyond the conservation value of the property as it exists right now. So it's not impossible, but it's definitely harder than, bringing in a new area. So.
Pause just because we are at the top of the hour and want to respect folks' evenings and John skipping time zones for us there. So how about let's close out the main meeting today. I think that certainly folks will be hanging around after this. But John, any final thoughts, words that you want to share before we close out the official meeting tonight?
I just want to thank everyone for attending. This is a really, really exciting process. One of the most exciting things I've ever worked on. It's definitely one of our director's top 3 priorities for our department right now is advancing this. So we really hope you stay engaged and stay involved. I think we're going to come up with something that's really going to benefit the county and the species that we're dealing with. So thank you.
Thank you, John, and thanks for folks on Zoom. We didn't get to all of the questions and comments, but we are saving Zoom chat. So there will be thoughts. So really appreciate everyone's evening tonight. So
Thank you all.
thank you all.
Thank you.
Yep, safe chat.
Do you know we had the 25 or 35? When a similar thing.